The year 1876 baked Arizona into a red brick. Dust was the first and last thing a person tasted, a fine grit that settled in the lungs and clouded the soul. It rose from the hooves of tired horses, billowed from the wheels of freight wagons, and hung in the air like a shroud over the town of Dry Creek. The town was a hopeful name for a place that had forgotten the memory of rain. It was little more than a single street of sun-bleached timber buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and the small house with a freshly painted sign that read, Dr. Samuel Whitmore, for his daughter, Eleanor. The dust was a constant reminder that she was a world away from the damp, green civility of Boston. At 22, she carried the East in the porcelain fairness of her skin and the deep blue of her eyes. It was a beauty that seemed fragile against the harsh landscape, like a wildflower attempting to bloom on stone. The men in town looked at her with a mixture of reverence and hunger, as if she were a cool drink of water they were not sure they were worthy of. The women watched her with a sharper, more calculating gaze, noting the fine stitching on her dresses and the way she held her shoulders, a posture that spoke of books and quiet rooms, not of scrubbing floors and fighting the endless war against the red dust. Eleanor felt their eyes on her but did not understand them. She saw only the vast, silent emptiness of the land, a place so wide and quiet it seemed to swallow sound. The mountains burned in the distance, their jagged peaks the color of old blood against the impossibly blue sky. This was a land of extremes, of scorching sun and freezing nights, of sudden, brutal violence and a profound, aching loneliness that seeped into her bones. She had followed her father here after her mother's passing, believing in his dream of bringing modern medicine to the frontier. But while he found purpose in setting bones and stitching wounds, Eleanor found only a deepening sense of dislocation. Her world had shrunk to the confines of their small house and the duties within it. A life measured in tending her father's instruments and praying for a rain that never came. The day the sky turned yellow, a sick, ominous shade. Eleanor was trying to coax life into a small patch of earth behind the house. She had brought seeds from Boston, stubborn little promises of lavender and rose, and they had failed, one by one, in the unforgiving soil. As she knelt, crumbling the dry earth between her fingers, a change came over the air. The usual dry heat grew heavy, suffocating. The silence of the desert was replaced by a low, distant moan that grew steadily into a roar. Her father appeared at the door, his face grim. He scanned the horizon, his medical eye assessing a symptom of the land itself. A wall of roiling red dust was moving toward them, a monstrous, churning wave that would devour the sky. He called her name, his voice tight with urgency, and she ran inside, her heart pounding against her ribs. They barred the door and shuttered the windows, plunging the small house into a dusty twilight. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked, a tormented sound that seemed to claw at the very foundations of the house. Red dust, fine as flour, forced its way through every crack and crevice, coating their furniture, their clothes, their tongues. It was like being buried alive. Eleanor sat at the small kitchen table, her hands clenched in her lap, listening to the world being unmade outside. Her father sat opposite her, cleaning his spectacles for the third time, a small, repetitive gesture against the overwhelming chaos. He spoke of the fragility of their existence here, of the power of a land that would always remain untamed. He reminded her of the rules of survival: trust no one you do not know, stay within the bounds of the town, and fear the native tribes who moved like ghosts through the canyons, remnants of a people this new world was trying to erase. The storm raged through the night. Sleep was impossible. Eleanor lay in her bed, listening to the symphony of destruction, and felt a strange, unsettling kinship with the wind. It sounded as lost and angry as she felt. Morning came not with light, but with a gradual lessening of the dark. The wind died down, leaving an eerie, muffled silence. When Dr. Whitmore unbarred the door, they looked out upon a transformed world. Everything was coated in a thick blanket of red dust. The town of Dry Creek looked like a settlement unearthed from an ancient tomb. The air was still and thick, the sun a pale, sickly wafer in the sky. There was work to be done. Her father left to check on his patients, his boots leaving the first new tracks in the dust. Eleanor was tasked with checking the well out back, to see if it had been fouled by the storm. She wrapped a shawl around her head, took a bucket, and stepped out into the strange new landscape. The silence was absolute. Her own footsteps seemed an intrusion. She walked toward the well, her eyes scanning the ground. The storm had swept the land clean of its usual clutter, revealing the stark contours of the earth. And then she saw it. Near the stone base of the well lay a shape, a heap of dark clothing and darker skin almost lost against the red earth. Her first thought was that it was a dead animal, a coyote or a stray dog caught in the storm. But as she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a man. He was lying face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for the well. His black hair was matted with dust and something dark and wet. His clothes were torn, and the skin of his back was a geography of cuts and bruises. He was an Indian. That much was clear from his moccasins and the stark, high line of his cheekbones. Eleanor froze, her father's warning screaming in her mind. A savage, an enemy, a danger to be avoided at all costs. She should turn around, run back to the house, and bolt the door. She should wait for her father, for the town sheriff, for anyone but herself to deal with this. But then the man moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible motion, a shudder that ran through his body. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of such profound agony that it cut through her fear. He was not a symbol of danger. He was a human being, dying of thirst and injury at the foot of her well. She took a hesitant step closer. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing. She could see the cracked, parched skin of his lips, the way the dust clung to his eyelashes. In that moment, he was not Navajo or Apache or any other name her father had used to categorize the people of this land. He was simply a man in desperate need. The teachings of her mother, a woman who believed in compassion above all else, rose to counter her father's pragmatism, the duties of a doctor's daughter, who had spent her life watching the battle against death, overwhelmed the fear of a Boston girl on the frontier. She set down the bucket and knelt beside him. Gently, she placed a hand on his shoulder. His skin was fever hot, even in the cool of the morning. She whispered a soft word, asking if he could hear her. There was no response, only another shallow, rattling breath. He needed water. She hurried to the well, her hands trembling as she lowered the bucket. It came up full of cool, clear water. She carried it back, sloshing some onto the red earth. How to make him drink. He was unconscious, or nearly so. She tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat, dipped it in the water, and gently moistened his lips. At the touch of the water, he stirred again. His eyes flickered open, but they were unfocused, clouded with pain. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She knew she could not leave him here. The sun was already beginning to climb, burning away the morning haze. The heat would kill him before the day was out. And soon, others would be stirring. The sheriff would make his rounds. Neighbors would come to draw water. If he was found here, what would they do? He was a native man, wounded and on the outskirts of a white settlement. She knew with a cold certainty that they would not offer him aid. They would finish the job his injuries had started. A decision, swift and absolute, took hold of her. It was a choice made not with her mind, but with some deeper, more elemental part of her being. She would not let him die. She looked around frantically. The house was impossible. Her father would be back soon. The only other shelter was the old, dilapidated barn at the edge of their property, a relic from the previous owner that now stood empty, save for some old tools and rotting hay. It was perfect. It was secluded. No one ever went there. Getting him there would be the challenge. She was not a large woman, and he was powerfully built, his shoulders broad even in his depleted state. She looped her arms under his, trying to pull him up. The effort was immense. He was a solid anchor of pain and unconsciousness. Gritting her teeth, she pulled, dragging him backward, one grueling inch at a time. His moccasins carved 2 long furrows in the thick dust. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The red dust rose around them, clinging to her sweat-slicked skin. She paused every few feet, her lungs burning, her vision swimming. During one of these pauses, his head lolled to the side. She saw his face clearly for the first time. It was a strong face, carved from the very rock of the mountains that loomed on the horizon. Despite the dirt and the blood, there was a fierce, proud beauty to it that stole her breath. A strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred in her chest, something warm and protective that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the man himself. Finally, after an eternity of straining and pulling, she reached the barn. The heavy door groaned in protest as she heaved it open just wide enough to slip through. The air inside was cool and smelled of old hay and dry rot. It was dark, the only light coming from the cracks in the wooden walls. She dragged him into the deepest shadow, collapsing beside him, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had moved him. She had hidden him. She sat there for a long moment, listening to the sound of her own frantic heartbeat and his shallow, labored breathing. She had crossed a line. She had brought a wanted man, an enemy of her people, into her sanctuary. She had defied her father, her town, and every rule of survival she had been taught. A great wave of fear washed over her, cold and sickening. What had she done? But then she looked at him, lying broken in the shadows, and the fear receded, replaced by that same stubborn warmth. She had done the only thing she could. She had chosen compassion over caution, humanity over law. She rose, smoothed down her dusty dress, and walked to the barn door. Peeking out, she saw the world was as it was. The sun was higher. The town was slowly coming to life. No one had seen her. Her secret was safe. For now. She closed the heavy door, plunging them back into darkness, and in the quiet cool of the barn, a new and dangerous chapter of her life began. The days that followed were a blur of secrecy and fear. Eleanor lived a double life, a quiet, dutiful daughter in the small, sunlit house, and a nervous conspirator in the shadows of the old barn. Each trip she made, carrying a small portion of their food or a jug of fresh water, was a journey fraught with peril. She moved with a stealth she never knew she possessed, her eyes constantly scanning the empty space between the house and the barn, her ears straining for the sound of her father's footsteps or a neighbor's call. The man in the barn remained lost in a world of fever and pain. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words in a language she did not understand, a river of soft, guttural sounds that spoke of a life lived under an entirely different sky. Eleanor did what she could. She cleaned his wounds with boiled water and carbolic soap from her father's supply, her touch gentle but firm. His injuries were severe. Beyond the cuts and bruises, there was a deep gash on his side, angry and inflamed. That worried her most. It was the color of a bad sunset, and hot to the touch. It was while cleaning this wound on the second day that she saw it. She had unlaced the tattered remnants of his leather shirt to better tend to his torso. The fever had slicked his skin with a sheen of sweat, and the muscles of his chest and shoulders were sharply defined, a landscape of hard-earned strength. There, over his heart, was a tattoo. It was not the crude ink of a sailor or a soldier. This was something else entirely. A complex maze of dark blue lines that formed a symbol she could not decipher. It was a pattern of angles and curves that seemed to speak of the sun and the eagle, a mark of identity that was as much a part of him as the color of his skin. She drew her hand back as if burned. She had seen similar markings on the Navajo weavers who occasionally came to the edge of town to trade blankets. This was a tribal marking. It was the brand of the enemy, the sign of the savage her father had warned her about. All the stories she had ever heard, tales told in hushed, fearful tones around campfires and in the general store, came flooding back. Stories of raids, of cruelty, of a people who were fundamentally, irrevocably other. The man on the hay groaned, his eyes fluttering beneath his lids, and the fear was momentarily replaced by a surge of pity. He was not a warrior now. He was a broken man, helpless and dependent on her mercy. Still, the discovery unsettled her to her core. She had not just saved a stranger. She had harbored a man her people considered their foe. The act of compassion now felt like an act of treason. The world outside the barn seemed to conspire to amplify her fears. 2 days later, a patrol of cavalry soldiers rode into Dry Creek, their blue uniforms and Union flags a stark, orderly contrast to the chaotic red dust. They brought with them a nervous energy that quickly spread through the town. Eleanor was at the general store, purchasing flour and salt, when she overheard the talk. The soldiers were not on a routine patrol. They were hunting a man. Sheriff Miller, a man whose authority came more from the size of his belly than the speed of his gun, was listening intently to a young, tight-lipped lieutenant. The name they spoke sent a chill through Eleanor's blood. Tarak. They were hunting a Navajo warrior named Tarak. He had been a scout for the army, they said, one of the best. But he had turned on them, betrayed a patrol, and escaped into the mountains. He was considered extremely dangerous, a renegade who knew the army's ways and the desert's secrets. A substantial bounty had been placed on his head, enough to make a poor man rich for life. Deputy Harlan, a younger man with restless eyes who had made his interest in Eleanor uncomfortably clear on several occasions, spoke up with a swagger. He said he would keep his eyes peeled, that no savage was going to hide in his territory for long. His gaze swept the store and landed on Eleanor, a possessive look that made her skin crawl. She quickly paid for her goods, her hands trembling so badly she could barely count the coins. She felt as if the name Tarak was branded on her forehead for all to see. She hurried home, her mind racing. Tarak. The man in her barn had a name, and it was the name of a wanted man, a fugitive with a price on his head. That evening, the sunset was a violent spectacle, a bleeding gash across the horizon that painted the dust in the air 100 shades of crimson and violet. The beauty of it was fierce and terrible, a perfect reflection of the turmoil in her soul. She and her father sat on their small porch, a nightly ritual they had maintained since arriving in this harsh land. But tonight, the comfortable silence between them was gone, replaced by a tense, unspoken current. Dr. Whitmore finally broke the quiet, his voice heavy. He had heard the news from the soldiers. Of course, the whole town was buzzing with it. He spoke of the necessity of law and order on the frontier, of the clear and unbreachable line between civilization and savagery. He looked at his daughter, his eyes full of a stern, protective love. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and serious, "these are dangerous times. This man they are hunting, this Tarak, he is a symptom of the disease of this land. A man who breaks faith with his own cannot be trusted. If you are to ever encounter such a person, you must not hesitate. You run. You find the sheriff. You do not let your good heart cloud your judgment." He paused, his gaze intense. To help a person like him is not an act of charity. It is a sin against God and a crime against the law. It endangers not just you, but this entire community. Do you understand me? "Yes, Father," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was the first time she had ever directly lied to him, and the betrayal of it was a physical pain, a tightening in her chest. She felt like a hypocrite, A fraud sitting beside this good, honest man who believed his daughter to be as pure and transparent as glass. Her inner world was a battleground. Every lesson she had ever been taught about duty, obedience, and her place as a virtuous woman warred against the powerful, primal instinct that had made her drag the dying man into the barn. She had been raised to believe that morality was a simple thing, a clear path of right and wrong laid out by the Bible and by society. But here, in this land of dust and silence, nothing was simple. Was it right to let a man die because of the color of his skin or the markings he bore? Was it wrong to offer water to the thirsty and comfort to the afflicted, no matter who they were? The image of the deputy, Harlan, flashed in her mind. His smug, cruel eyes. She knew what men like him would do if they found Tarak. There would be no trial, no justice, only a rope and a bounty payment. The thought of it, of this man who was utterly at her mercy being handed over to that kind of fate, solidified something within her. It was no longer just about compassion. It was about defiance. It was a rebellion against the casual brutality of the world she found herself in. That night, she slipped out to the barn later than usual, the moon a cold, silver coin in the black sky. Tarek's fever had worsened. He was tossing in the hay, his body rigid with chills. She bathed his face with a cool cloth, whispering soothing words that he could not understand but might feel in some deep part of his troubled sleep. She sat with him for hours, the only sounds the whisper of the wind through the cracks in the walls and his own ragged breathing. She was terrified. If she were discovered, her life and her father's would be ruined. She would be branded, ostracized, seen as no better than a common woman who consorted with savages. She could lose everything, her home, her reputation, her freedom. But as she looked at his face in the pale moonlight, the strong lines of his jaw and the proud arch of his nose, she knew she could not turn back. She had made her choice the moment she had pulled him from the dust. She had bound her fate to his, here, in the shadows of the old barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and the weight of her secret. Eleanor Whitmore ceased to be merely her father's daughter. She was a woman making a stand, alone, against the world she knew. The arid silence of the desert had crept into her heart, and there, a dangerous and unfamiliar flower was beginning to take root. The fever broke on the 5th day. Eleanor entered the barn in the pre-dawn gloom and found him not in a heap of restless sleep, but propped up on one elbow, watching her. His eyes were no longer clouded with pain. They were clear, dark, and startlingly intelligent. They were the eyes of a hawk, missing nothing. She stopped dead, the small parcel of bread and dried meat clutched in her hand. The silence in the barn was suddenly different. It was no longer the empty silence of sickness, but the charged, waiting silence between two living, breathing people. He said nothing. He simply watched her, his gaze tracking her every small movement as she set the food down and approached with the water canteen. She knelt a few feet away, her heart a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. All the things she had planned to say, the simple questions about his health, evaporated in the intensity of his stare. She felt exposed, as if he could see the secret life she had been living, the lies she had told, the fear that was her constant companion. She held out the canteen, water. The word was a thin, reedy sound in the quiet space. He continued to watch her for a long moment before giving a slow, deliberate nod. He took the canteen, his fingers brushing against hers. His touch was warm and firm, a jolt of life that shot up her arm. He drank deeply, his throat working. When he was finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and handed the canteen back, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you," he said. The words were a surprise, a low, rough sound, like stones grinding together in a dry riverbed. His English was heavily accented but clear. "You are welcome," she managed to reply. "You have been very sick." He nodded again, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He looked down at his bandaged side, then back at her. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Why? Why had she done this? She had no answer, none that she could put into words. Their communication in the days that followed was sparse, built from single words and gestures. A quiet understanding grew in the spaces between their languages. He would point to the sliver of sky visible through a crack in the wall and say a word in his own tongue, a word that sounded like the whisper of the wind itself. She would repeat it, her Boston accent clumsy against the ancient sounds. She would then say sky, and he would repeat it, his voice shaping the foreign word with care. They built a small, secret vocabulary: water, bread, sun, moon, pain, heal. He told her his name was Tarak. She told him hers was Eleanor. He said it slowly, the syllables a soft caress in his rough voice. He spoke very little about himself or how he came to be wounded and left for dead. He was a man wrapped in a profound stillness, his economy of motion matched by his economy of words. But his eyes were always speaking. They held a deep, abiding sorrow, the look of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. But there was strength there too, an unbreakable core of resilience that she found herself increasingly drawn to. He was nothing like the wild, unthinking savage from the stories. He was quiet, observant, and possessed a dignity that seemed to fill the small, dark space of the barn. The ritual of tending to his wounds continued, but now it was different. It was an act performed not on an unconscious body, but on a man who was acutely aware of her presence, of her touch. The water she brought each day became a powerful symbol between them. In this desiccated land, where water was life itself, her daily offering was a profound gesture of trust and care for her. The act of cleansing his body became a strange, intimate ritual that chipped away at the foundations of her own carefully constructed world. One afternoon, the heat was particularly oppressive. The air in the barn was thick and still. Tarek's side wound needed cleaning and redressing. She brought a basin of warm water and fresh bandages, her movements slow and deliberate in the suffocating heat. He had removed the tattered remains of his shirt, and his chest was bare. She tried to keep her gaze clinical, focused on the task at hand, but it was impossible not to see the raw, masculine beauty of him. The sun, slanting through a high crack in the wall, illuminated the dark blue tattoo over his heart, the hard lines of his collarbone, the smooth, taut skin stretched over his ribs. She knelt beside him and dipped a cloth in the warm water. As she began to clean the area around the gash, she was intensely aware of his stillness, of the warmth radiating from his skin. She could feel his eyes on her, and she risked a glance up. His gaze was direct, unwavering, and it held a heat that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. It was a look of raw, unguarded hunger. But it was not just physical. It was a deeper yearning. For life, for connection, for the simple human comfort she was offering. In that moment, the barn, the town, the entire world outside seemed to fall away. There was only the two of them, suspended in a sliver of dusty sunlight. Her breath caught in her throat. A slow, spreading warmth bloomed in her belly. A feeling so foreign and powerful it frightened her. It was a feeling of profound, dangerous yearning, a mirror of the look in his eyes. It was both a sin and a prayer. Her hand, holding the wet cloth, trembled. The gaze held for a heartbeat too long, a silent confession of a truth that neither of them dared to speak. She broke the contact first, her eyes dropping back to his wound. She finished her work in silence, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency that belied the storm raging inside her. When she was done, she gathered the basin and the soiled cloths, her face burning. She could still feel his eyes on her as she walked to the door. The danger outside the barn was a constant, gnawing presence. The bounty on Tarek's head had made every man in Dry Creek a potential hunter. She saw them gathering in front of the saloon, their talk loud and boastful, polishing their rifles and planning sweeps of the surrounding territory. Deputy Harlan was at the center of it, his ambition a sharp, ugly thing. His eyes seemed to follow her everywhere, and each time he looked at her, she felt a cold knot of dread. He saw her as a prize to be won, like the bounty, and she knew instinctively that he was a man who would not be deterred by a simple no. The fear of discovery was a physical weight on her shoulders. She understood with perfect clarity what would happen if her secret was revealed. The town would turn on her in an instant. The women who now nodded politely would whisper behind their hands, their eyes full of scorn. They would call her a fallen woman, an Indian's companion. The word was a vile thing, a brand of ultimate shame from which there was no recovery. Her father would be destroyed. His practice, his standing, his entire life in this new place would be reduced to ash. He would look at her with eyes full of a shame and disappointment that would be worse than any punishment the law could devise. She was caught between two impossible worlds. In the light of day, she was Eleanor Whitmore, the doctor's respectable, virtuous daughter. In the shadows of the barn, she was a criminal, a traitor, a woman tending to a forbidden man and feeling a forbidden desire. Every trip with a basin of water, every stolen moment of shared silence, was another step away from the life she was supposed to live. Her heart was cracking, splitting open like the dry earth, and she did not know if the thing growing in that new space was a beautiful, rare flower or a deadly, poisonous weed. She only knew that she could not stop watering it. His recovery was a false dawn. For 2 days, he seemed to gather strength, his movements becoming more certain, his appetite returning. He watched Eleanor with a quiet intensity that she was beginning to find more comforting than unsettling. But on the third night, the heat returned. It came on him suddenly. A vicious, consuming fire that started deep within and radiated outward until his skin was scorching to the touch. The gash on his side, which had appeared to be closing, was now an angry, swollen purple, weeping a thin, foul fluid. The infection was poisoning him from the inside out. Eleanor knew this with the grim certainty of a doctor's daughter. She had seen men in her father's care succumb to such fevers, their bodies racked with delirium until their hearts simply gave out. A desperate, cold fear seized her. She spent the night bathing his forehead with cool cloths, but it was like trying to quell a forest fire with a cup of water. The heat would recede for a moment under her touch, only to surge back with greater intensity. He began to mutter again, not the soft, river-like sounds of his own language, but sharp, broken cries of pain that tore at her soul. By morning, he was lost to her, his body a battlefield. He tossed in the hay, his powerful muscles bunching and releasing in violent shudders. His eyes, when they opened, were glassy and saw nothing. She tried to make him drink, but the water dribbled from the corners of his mouth. She was losing him. The thought was not an abstract fear. It was a sharp, physical agony in her own chest. The man who had looked at her with such profound, silent understanding was disappearing into the furnace of his own body. She was alone with this. She could not go to her father, for that would mean confessing everything and condemning them both. She was his only hope, and her simple remedies were failing. She sat back on her heels in the dusty straw, her mind racing, searching through every scrap of medical knowledge she had gleaned from her father's books and conversations. Poultices, herbal teas. Nothing she had access to would be strong enough to fight a poison so deep. And then she remembered something her father had said long ago about treating a child with a runaway fever in Boston. When the body's own heat becomes the enemy, you must fight fire with its opposite. You must cool the entire body, quickly, to shock the system and break the fever's grip. The only way to do that was with a full bath. The idea was so outrageous, so impossible, that she almost dismissed it at once. It was an act of unthinkable intimacy, a violation of every boundary of propriety that had ever been drilled into her. To undress a man, a native man, and bathe him like a child. It was scandalous. It was a sin. But then she looked at him, at the tremor running through his powerful frame, and she heard the death rattle in his breathing. What was a sin against propriety compared to the sin of letting a man die when you had the power to save him? Her decision was made in that moment. The fear for her reputation was a pale, flimsy thing compared to the ferocious, primal need to keep him alive. The logistics of her plan were a nightmare. The barn had an old, forgotten watering trough in a corner, half filled with ancient, dusty rainwater. It was large enough. She spent an hour dragging it to the center of the barn, her muscles straining, her hands raw. Then she had to empty it, scooping out the foul water and debris with a bucket, before scrubbing it clean as best she could. The water was the next problem. The well was too public, but there was a rain barrel at the back of the house, partially filled from a brief shower weeks ago. In the blistering heat of the day, with her father away on his rounds, she began the arduous process of carrying the water, bucket by bucket, from the house to the barn. Each trip was a torment of fear. She imagined eyes on her from every window, her father returning early, Deputy Harlan making an unexpected visit. But the street remained quiet, lost in its midday stupor. She needed warm water, not cold, to avoid shocking his system too severely. Behind the barn, hidden by a crumbling stone wall, she built a small, smokeless fire with dry kindling, heating the water one kettle at a time, a process that took hours. The sun was beginning to set by the time she had filled the trough with enough lukewarm water. Her dress was soaked with sweat and streaked with dirt. Her body ached with a weariness so profound it was almost a comfort. As twilight bled through the cracks in the barn walls, she went to Tarak. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. She spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him what she was about to do, though she knew he likely could not understand. Getting him from the hay to the trough was the hardest part of all. He was a dead weight, his body uncooperative. She half dragged, half carried him, his fevered skin searing her own. Her arms were wrapped around his bare chest, her face pressed against his shoulder. The scent of him, of dust and sweat and sickness, filled her senses. It was an intimacy born of pure desperation. With a final, desperate heave, she managed to get him over the edge of the trough. He slumped into the water, which splashed over the sides, soaking the dirt floor. He was a large man in a small space, his long legs bent, his head lolled back against the wooden rim. His eyes were closed. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took the bar of soap she had brought and a soft cloth. Then, her hands trembling, she began to bathe him. She started with his face, gently washing away the grime and sweat, tracing the strong lines of his brow, his cheekbones, his jaw, then his neck and his shoulders, her hands moving over the hard, coiled muscles. She tried to remain detached, to think of it as a purely medical procedure, but it was impossible. This was not a patient. This was Tarak. She was touching him in a way she had never touched another human being, her fingers learning the texture of his skin, the landscape of his body. The steam rose around them, creating a small, private world in the cavernous dark of the barn. The only sounds were the soft splash of the water and his ragged breathing. She worked her way down his chest, over the intricate tattoo that lay over his heart. Her fingers traced the lines of it. A secret script she could not read but was beginning to understand was the very map of his soul. She washed the angry, infected wound on his side with extreme care, her touch as gentle as a prayer. She was leaning over the trough, rinsing the cloth. When he moved, it was not a gentle stirring, but a sudden, violent shudder, a massive tremor that convulsed his entire body. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, and his body arched in the water. The sudden movement caught her completely off guard. She was off balance, her shoes slipping on the wet, muddy floor. For a heart-stopping second, she flailed, her arms windmilling in the steamy air, and then she fell. The Virgin slipped into his bath. She landed in the water with a great splash, her legs tangled with his. The lukewarm water felt shockingly cold against her heated skin. It soaked through her thin cotton nightdress in an instant, plastering it to her body, leaving nothing to the imagination. She came up sputtering, her hair dripping in her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that threatened to break them. He had gone still. The violent shudder had passed, and his eyes were open. They were no longer the glazed, unseeing eyes of a fevered man. They were his eyes, clear, dark, focused entirely on her. He was looking at her, not through her. He saw her. He saw her tangled in his limbs, her drenched dress clinging to every curve of her body, her face just inches from his own in the rising steam. The world stopped. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. She expected to see confusion in his eyes, or perhaps anger. She was prepared for lust, for the raw, animal hunger of a man looking upon a woman in such a state of undress. But what she saw in his gaze was none of those things. It was something far more profound and infinitely more devastating to her composure. She saw gratitude, a deep, soul-shaking thankfulness that was as clear as a spoken word. She saw a fierce, desperate desire, not for her body, but for the life she was fighting to give him. And underneath it all, she saw a flicker of awe, of wonder, as if he were seeing a spirit, a miracle rising from the water to save him. In that endless moment, suspended in the water with him, she felt the last of her old self dissolve. The carefully constructed walls of propriety, of duty, of what was right and what was wrong, crumbled into dust and were washed away. All that was left was this man, his dark eyes holding hers, and a truth so powerful it felt like a physical blow. She was no longer just his savior. She was bound to him, her soul tangled with his as surely as her limbs were. The love she had been fighting, the desire she had been denying, was not a sweet sin. It was simply the truest thing she had ever known. A blush of such intensity spread from her neck to her hairline that she was sure it was visible even in the gloom. She scrambled to her feet, clumsy and shaking, and climbed out of the trough, water streaming from her dress to puddle at her feet. She did not dare to look at him again. She grabbed a rough blanket, her hands fumbling, and managed to help him from the water. His fever had not broken, but the violent edge of it had passed. He was weak but lucid. She dried him as best she could, her movements hurried and jerky, before settling him into a fresh pile of hay, covered with every blanket she could find. Then, without a backward glance, she fled the barn, her heart a wild, triumphant, terrified drum against the silence of the night. The bath broke the fever, but it shattered the world. In the 2 days that followed, the air in the barn was thick with a new, fragile intimacy. The dynamic of caregiver and patient was gone, replaced by a profound and unspoken awareness of each other. Tarak's strength returned with astonishing speed. He moved with a quiet grace, his body no longer a broken thing but a vessel of contained power. He would watch her for long stretches of time, his dark eyes communicating a depth of feeling that words could never capture. He was grateful. She knew that, but it was more than gratitude. It was a look of recognition, as if he had seen the core of her soul in that moment in the water, and had claimed it as his own. For Eleanor, the barn had become her only reality. The town, her father, her former life, all seemed like a distant, fading dream. She found herself inventing reasons to stay longer, to share the silence with him. They spoke little, but every shared glance, every small gesture, was a conversation. She would bring him food, and he would take it from her hands with a gentleness that made her breath catch. He was no longer a secret she was keeping, but a truth she was living. She was in love. The realization was no longer frightening. It was simply a fact, as solid and real as the red earth beneath her feet. She had fallen, not just into the water, but out of the world she had known and into his. But the world she had abandoned had not forgotten her. Deputy Harlan's interest had curdled into obsession. He could not understand her rejection of him, her quiet withdrawal. He saw it as an insult, a challenge to his pride. He began to watch her. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. He saw her slip away from the house at odd hours. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she scanned the street as if expecting a threat. His mind, steeped in jealousy and ambition, began to invent scenarios, each one darker than the last. He convinced himself that she had a secret lover. One night, driven by a gnawing suspicion, he crept onto the Whitmore property. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. He moved in the shadows, his boots silent in the deep dust. He saw a faint, flickering light coming from the cracks of the old barn. His heart began to pound with a vicious, triumphant rhythm. He crept closer, his hand on the butt of his pistol. He put his eye to a wide crack in the timber. What he saw stopped his breath. The light came from a small lantern. In its soft glow, Eleanor was sitting on a hay bale, mending a tear in a man's leather shirt. And the man, sitting opposite her, was the Navajo warrior, Tarak. He was not a prisoner or a patient. He was watching her work, a soft, private smile on his face. The scene was one of shocking domesticity, of a quiet, shared peace that Harlan had only ever dreamed of having with her. Rage, cold and pure, washed over him. It was a rage born of jealousy, of racial hatred, and of a deep, wounded pride. She had not chosen a secret lover from the town. She had chosen this, a savage, a fugitive. He saw not a man, but the bounty, the creature the army was hunting. And he saw his opportunity. He could have the money, the glory, and his revenge all at once. By destroying Tarak, he would expose Eleanor, leaving her shamed, ruined, and with nowhere to turn but to him. He backed away from the barn, a cruel smile twisting his lips in the darkness. He did not go to the sheriff. He went straight to the lieutenant in charge of the cavalry patrol. The next afternoon, as Eleanor was preparing to take Tarak his meal, he stopped her. He had been restless all day, pacing the confines of the barn like a caged wolf. He stood before her now, his face a mask of grim urgency. "They are coming," he said, his voice a low rumble. Who is coming?" she asked, her heart beginning to flutter with a sudden, nameless dread. "The soldiers. I can feel it. The air has changed." He looked down at her, his hands coming up to gently cup her face. His touch was warm and steady. "You have saved my life. Eleanor, I will not bring this danger to your door any longer. I must leave." "No," she whispered, the word a desperate plea. "You are not strong enough. Where will you go?" "I am strong enough," he said, his voice firm. "And I will go where they cannot find me, but I will find my way back to you. I promise you this." Tears welled in her eyes. She did not want to believe him. She did not want to let him go. But she saw the iron resolve in his eyes, the warrior's instinct that had kept him alive this long. He knew the danger better than she did. He pulled her to him, a swift, hard embrace that stole her breath. He held her for only a moment, but in that moment, she felt the entire world shift. Then he released her, gave her one last, burning look, and slipped out the back of the barn, vanishing into the shimmering heat haze of the desert as silently as a ghost. She stood there for a long time, the empty barn echoing the new emptiness in her soul. She did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later, she heard the thunder of hooves. The cavalry patrol, led by the triumphant Deputy Harlan and the stern-faced lieutenant, surrounded the property. They stormed the barn first, their guns drawn. Eleanor watched from the porch, her body frozen. As Harlan emerged, his face a mask of fury. He had found the trough, the discarded bandages, the lingering scent of another human being, but his prize was gone. "He was here!" Harlan shouted, his voice cracking with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at Eleanor. "She hid him. The doctor's daughter has been hiding that murdering savage." The accusation, shouted for all the town to hear, was like a physical blow. Her father came rushing out of the house, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The lieutenant approached Eleanor, his eyes cold and hard. "Is this true? Miss, have you been aiding a fugitive?" Eleanor lifted her chin, the terror inside her solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. She would not let them see her break. "I do not know what you are talking about," she said, her voice steady. Harlan laughed. A short, ugly sound. "She is a liar. Search the house. The whole town knows she has a soft spot for the wrong kind. It is a sickness. The whole place is tainted by her sin. It needs to be cleansed." His words, shouted to the gathering crowd, were a spark in a tinderbox. The townspeople, their fear of the unknown fanned by Harlan's rhetoric, began to murmur. The murmur grew into a growl. They saw not a young woman, but a traitor, the source of the danger that had been haunting them. Someone threw a stone that struck the porch near her feet, and then someone threw a torch. It landed on the dry timber of the porch with a soft whoosh, and the flames, fed by the dry, thirsty wood, erupted with terrifying speed. Another torch followed, crashing through the front window. The crowd surged forward, their individual faces lost in a single, monstrous expression of mob fury. They were not just destroying a house, they were performing an exorcism, burning out the sin they believed had taken root in their midst. It all happened so fast. Her father screamed her name, his face a mask of horror. He pushed through the soldiers, trying to get to her, but the heat was already a solid wall. Eleanor was frozen, a scream trapped in her throat, watching her world burn. A piece of the flaming porch roof collapsed, a shower of embers raining down on her. The pain was searing, a line of fire across her arm and shoulder. It was the pain that broke her paralysis. She turned to run, to escape the inferno, but her father was no longer trying to reach her. He had seen the flames licking at the room that served as his office, where his life's work, his medical books and journals from Boston, were kept. With a cry of despair, he turned and ran into the burning house. "Father, no!" she screamed, her voice finally breaking free. She tried to follow him, to pull him back, but a strong hand seized her burned arm, sending a fresh wave of agony through her. The lieutenant was pulling her away from the fire, his face grim. "It is too late for him. Miss, you will not die too." She fought against him, a wild, cornered animal, her eyes fixed on the house, which was now completely engulfed in flames. She saw a shape in the window of her father's office, a brief, fleeting silhouette against the roaring orange. And then the roof collapsed inward with a sound like the world ending. A single, soul-tearing scream was ripped from her throat, a sound of such utter loss that it momentarily silenced the mob. And then she knew no more. She awoke to pain and darkness. The pain was a living thing, a fire that licked along her arm and shoulder. The darkness was the inside of a freight wagon, the air thick with the smell of dust and her own despair. She was a prisoner. Her hands were bound. She had lost everything. Her home was a pile of ashes. Her father was dead. Her reputation was a ruin. The man she'd loved was gone, a fugitive in the desert. They stopped at a military outpost, a collection of tents and rough-hewn buildings. She was taken to a small, windowless room and left alone with her grief and her pain. Later, the lieutenant came in. He was not unkind, but his voice was firm, official. He asked her questions. Where did Tarek go? Which direction was he heading? Did he have allies? Eleanor looked at him, her blue eyes dark with a pain that went far beyond her physical injuries. She had nothing left to lose. They had taken her entire world, but they would not take this. They would not take him. The love that had been a secret, beautiful thing growing in the shadows of the barn was now all she had. It had become a crime, the heaviest sin of her life, and she would carry the weight of it with a fierce, unbreakable silence. She said nothing. She simply stared through him, her silence a wall he could not breach. He could burn her home. He could watch her father die. He could bind her and imprison her. But he could not make her betray Tarek. Loving him had cost her everything. It was the only thing she had left to give. Grief was a hollow room inside her, a place where the echoes of her father's last cry and the roar of the fire played over and over. Pain was a constant, sharp-toothed animal gnawing on her arm and shoulder. But fear, she discovered, had been burned away with everything else, in the small, dark storeroom that served as her cell. Eleanor sat on the hard-packed earth floor and found a strange, cold calm. They had questioned her for 2 days. The lieutenant, other soldiers, even a grim-faced captain. They offered comfort, then threats. They asked her where the renegade had gone. They asked for his plans, his people, his weaknesses. She met every question with the same vast, empty silence. She had nothing left for them to take. Her silence was the only thing in the world that was still hers, and she would not give it up. On the third night, she lay curled on a thin, rough blanket, drifting in a shallow, pain-filled sleep. A sound, small and sharp, like a mouse gnawing on wood, pulled her awake. Her eyes snapped open in the pitch darkness. The sound came again, from the small, high window, a space barely large enough for a man's head, barred on the outside. She sat up, her heart a slow, heavy drum. It was not a mouse. It was the sound of metal scraping against metal. A shadow blotted out the faint starlight in the window. There was a soft crack, and one of the iron bars was pulled free. Then another. She held her breath, her body rigid. A figure, lean and dark, squeezed through the opening and dropped to the floor with a silence that seemed to defy gravity. He moved not like a man, but like a piece of the night itself. He knelt before her, and in the gloom she saw the unmistakable silhouette of his face. Tarek. A soft, desperate sound escaped her throat, a name and a prayer all in one. He put a finger to her lips, his touch gentle but firm, commanding silence. His eyes, accustomed to the darkness, scanned her face, then moved to the crude bandage on her arm. She saw a flicker of something terrible in his gaze, a cold, contained fury at the sight of her injury. He spoke a single word, a whisper softer than the wind. "Come." He worked on the lock of the door with a thin piece of metal he had produced from his boot. It seemed an impossible task, but after a few agonizingly long moments, there was a soft click. He opened the door a crack, peering out into the moonlit camp. The outpost was quiet, the soldiers lost in sleep or the dullness of their watch. He moved with a predatory grace, leading her by the hand through the shadows between the tents. Her heart was a frantic, terrified thing now, pounding with a fear not for herself, but for him. If they were caught, he would be killed on the spot. His hand in hers was a warm, living anchor in a world of ghosts. He seemed to know the sentries' patterns, the blind spots, the very rhythm of the sleeping camp. They moved like wraiths past the horse lines, the silent cannons, and the dying embers of a campfire. In moments, they were at the edge of the camp, the vast, silent desert stretching out before them under a canopy of cold, indifferent stars. He did not pause. He pulled her forward into the immense darkness, and they began to run. The flight was a nightmare of endurance. Tarek set a relentless pace, half carrying her when she stumbled. The desert at night was a different world, a landscape of silver and black, of strange, twisted shapes and deep shadows. The pain in her arm, a dull throb in the camp, became a searing agony with every jarring step. They ran until her lungs were on fire and her legs were trembling, until the outpost was a distant, flickering memory behind them. When he finally allowed them to rest, it was in the shelter of a rock outcropping that shielded them from the open plain. He gave her water from a skin he carried, his movements efficient and sure. He was in his element here. The desert was not his enemy. It was his home, his ally. He looked at her burned arm, his face grim in the moonlight. He gently unwrapped the soldier's clumsy bandage. The skin was red and blistered, angry and weeping. "This needs medicine," he said, his voice low. "The army's poison." She did not know if he meant the infection or the act itself, but she knew he was right. A fever was already beginning to bloom beneath her skin, a familiar, sickly heat. He rewrapped the wound with a strip of clean cloth from his own shirt and gave her another drink of water. "We must keep moving," he said. "They will follow at first light." As they traveled, a strange transformation began to take place within Eleanor. Her body was a vessel of misery. Her arm throbbed with a relentless rhythm. The fever clouded her thoughts, and her muscles screamed with a fatigue so deep it felt as if it were in her bones. She was exhausted, starved, and in constant pain. And yet, for the first time in her life, she felt utterly and completely free. Out here, under the immense, star-dusted bowl of the sky, there were no walls. There were no townspeople with their narrow, judging eyes. There were no rules of conduct, no duties to perform, no expectations to meet. The life that had been a cage of silk and propriety had been burned to the ground. She was nothing now. She had no name but the one Tarak whispered. She had no possessions but the torn, ragged dress she wore. She had no future but to follow this silent man into the heart of the wilderness. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it was a strange and powerful liberation. The grief for her father was a hard, solid stone in her heart, a weight she would carry forever. But it was a clean grief, a pure loss. It was not complicated by the thousand small resentments and frustrations of her life in Dry Creek. As her fever rose, the world took on a dreamlike quality. She would look up at the moon and see not a celestial body, but a friendly lantern lighting their way. The cry of a distant coyote was not a threat, but a song of welcome. She had been stripped of everything, and in that nakedness, she found a new and elemental connection to the world around her. She was no longer a guest in this harsh land. She was a part of it, as wild and untamed as the wind that whipped her hair across her face. They traveled for 2 days, Tarak moving with an animal instinct for the land, finding hidden springs of water and sheltering them from the brutal sun in narrow canyons. He was the caregiver now, a role reversal that was not lost on her even in her fevered state. He was tireless, his strength seemingly endless. He would hunt small game with a slingshot, sharing the meager meals with her. At night, he would hold her as she shivered with fever, his body a warm, solid shield against the cold and her nightmares. On the 3rd day, she knew she could go on no longer. The fever was a raging fire, and her vision was starting to blur at the edges. She stumbled and fell, and this time, she could not find the strength to rise. Tarak knelt beside her, his face etched with worry. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and began to walk. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of his heart against her ear and the strength of his arms around her. When she woke, it was to a profound stillness and a sudden, welcome coolness. They were no longer under the open sky. She was lying on a soft bed of furs in a cavern. The air was cool and smelled of ancient stone and dry earth. The only light came from the entrance, a narrow slit in a wall of red rock, through which she could see a sliver of brilliant blue sky. The cave was a womb. It was a place of safety, hidden from the world, from the sun, from the soldiers who were surely hunting them. She saw Tarak across the cavern, grinding something on a flat stone. He brought it to her, a dark, fragrant paste, and gently applied it to her burn. The poultice was cool and soothing. and she felt the fire in her arm begin to recede almost immediately. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "A safe place," he said. He gave her water from a hollowed-out gourd. It was the sweetest, coolest water she had ever tasted. "My people have come here for generations. It is a place for healing, a place to be reborn." She looked around the cavern. On the walls, faded with time, were paintings, figures of men and animals, of suns and spirals. It was a sacred place, she realized. A church made of living rock. He had not just brought her to a hideout, he had brought her to his soul. She lay there for days, drifting in and out of a healing sleep. Tarak tended to her with a quiet, unwavering devotion. He fed her broth and strange, bitter teas that brought down her fever. He kept the poultice on her arm fresh. He spoke to her in low tones, sometimes in English, sometimes in his own language, the words flowing over her like a gentle stream. As the fever left her body, she felt the last vestiges of her old life leave her as well. The rigid beliefs her father had instilled in her, the black and white morality of her Boston upbringing, seemed like relics from another person's life. Her faith had died in the fire that took her father. Here, in this cave, a new faith was taking root. It was not a faith in a distant, punishing God, but a faith in the resilience of the human body, in the healing power of the earth, and in the profound, unshakable goodness of the man who had saved her. She had been born Eleanor Whitmore in a world of rules and religion, but in the cool, dark heart of this sacred cave, she was being reborn as something else entirely. She was being reborn as herself. A year is a lifetime in the desert. It is long enough for rock to be scoured by wind, for a river to change its course, and for a life burned to ashes to grow again from the scorched earth, 1 year after the fire, in a place that was not on any map. Eleanor found she had not just survived, she had been replanted. They lived in a small, sheltered canyon where 3 streams met, a place of rare greenness in the vast red landscape. It was a natural crossroads, and, over time, a small, unspoken community had formed there. It was not a town. It had no sheriff, no church, no single street of false-fronted buildings. It was a meeting place, a neutral ground born of necessity. Navajo families would come down from the mesas to trade blankets and silver for flour and steel knives. White trappers and prospectors, men who had left the so-called civilized world behind, would emerge from the mountains with their furs and their findings. Occasionally, a caravan of Mexican traders would pass through, their mules laden with spices and salt. It was a fragile ecosystem of commerce and cautious tolerance, a place where a person's worth was measured not by the color of their skin or the god they prayed to, but by the honesty of their trade and the straightness of their gaze. In this place, Eleanor had a name. They called her the Healer Woman. Her home was a small hogan Tarak had built for her, a solid structure of earth and wood that was cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Outside it, she cultivated a garden, a miracle of life coaxed from the stubborn soil. She grew not the fragile roses of Boston, but the hardy, potent herbs of the desert, plants whose secrets had been taught to her by Tarak and the Navajo women who had slowly, cautiously, accepted her into their world. The knowledge her father had given her, the knowledge she had thought lost in the fire, had found new life here. It bloomed in her hands. She knew how to clean a wound to prevent infection, how to set a broken bone with straight, strong splints. But now she also knew which leaves, when crushed into a poultice, would draw out the poison of a snake bite, and which roots, when boiled into a tea, would break a stubborn fever. She became a bridge between 2 worlds of healing, blending the careful science of her father with the ancient, earth-born wisdom of her new people. A grizzled trapper, a man named Jedediah, whose face was a roadmap of hard living, brought his young daughter to her one afternoon. The child was burning with fever, her breathing a shallow, rattling sound. Jedediah was a man who trusted no one, least of all a white woman living with a Navajo warrior. But desperation had driven him to Eleanor's door. She took the child in, her movements calm and sure. She did not bleed the child, as her father might have. Instead, she bathed her in cool water and gave her a bitter tea that Tarek had shown her how to make. She sat with the girl through the night, listening to her breathing, her presence a quiet, steady comfort. By morning, the fever had broken. Jedediah said nothing, but he left a fine beaver pelt at her door, a payment of deep, unspoken respect. Weeks later, a Navajo woman came to her hand badly cut by a careless knife. Eleanor stitched the wound with a fine, clean needle, just as she had seen her father do 1,000 times, and then dressed it with a paste of herbs to ward off spirits and sickness. The woman looked at the neat line of stitches with wonder, and then at Eleanor with a new understanding. Tarek, too, had found a new purpose in this place beyond borders. He was no longer a fugitive hiding in the shadows. Here, he was a leader. He carried a quiet authority that everyone, Navajo and white alike, seemed to recognize. He had been a scout for the army, and he understood the white man's mind, his language, his strange and often brutal logic. He was Navajo, and he understood the deep currents of his own people, their traditions, their pride, their long memory of injustice. He became the bridge. Eleanor would watch him as he mediated a dispute between a prospector who claimed his gear was stolen and a young Navajo hunter who claimed the man was trespassing on sacred ground. Tarek would listen to both sides, his face impassive, his dark eyes missing nothing. He would speak in English, his voice low and reasonable, and then in the flowing, musical tones of his own language. He did not issue commands. He forged understanding. He spoke of shared needs, of the harshness of the land that was an enemy to them all, of the respect that even strangers must show each other to survive. More often than not, the dispute would end not with violence, but with a quiet, grudging handshake, a trade of goods, a new line drawn in the sand that both sides could accept. He was the anchor of this fragile community, the man who held the disparate threads together and wove them into something resembling peace. But the greatest symbol of their new world was not in Eleanor's healing or Tarek's leadership. It was in the small, sleeping form that lay in a cradle board inside their hogan. They had a son. Eleanor had named him Samuel, in a quiet, tearful tribute to the father she had lost. He was a beautiful child, with Tarek's raven-black hair and strong, sturdy limbs. But when he opened his eyes, they were not the dark, knowing eyes of his father. They were the deep, impossible blue of her own. He was a child of two worlds, a living, breathing testament to a love that had refused to recognize the borders men drew on maps and in their hearts. When the Navajo women came to see him, they would touch his soft black hair and marvel at his sky-colored eyes. When the gruff trappers and prospectors saw him, they would fall silent, their hard faces softening at the sight of this small, perfect miracle. In a land defined by conflict, by the violent clash of cultures, Samuel was an emblem of a different possibility. He was a promise of a future where a man was not defined by the blood of his ancestors, but by the strength of his own heart. One evening, as the sun set, painting the canyon walls in hues of gold and rose, Eleanor sat outside the hogan, nursing her son. Tarek came and sat beside her, leaning his back against the warm earth of their home. He had spent the day negotiating a trade for corn with a group of settlers, a tense affair that had left him weary. He watched her with the baby, a look of profound peace on his face. "He has your eyes," Tarek said, his voice a soft rumble. He reached out and gently touched the baby's cheek with one long finger. "And your spirit," Eleanor replied, a small smile on her lips. "He is not afraid of anything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the evening, the chirp of crickets, the low murmur of the streams. The ghosts of the past were never far away. She would never forget the roar of the fire or the look on her father's face. Tarek would never forget the betrayal of the army or the long, lonely years of being hunted. Their shared history was a landscape of scars. But here, in this small pocket of peace, those scars were not a source of pain, but a reminder of the price they had paid for this life, for this love. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly, her gaze on the distant, darkening horizon. "The world you came from?" He was silent for a long moment, considering her question. "I miss the green," she clarified. "The rain, the civility." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark and serious in the fading light. "My world is here," he said, his gaze encompassing her, their son, their small home. "I was a ghost before I found you at the well, a man without a people, without a place. You and the boy." He paused, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "You are my land. You are my home." His words settled in her heart, a warmth that spread through her entire being. She had once looked at this vast, empty landscape and seen only loneliness. Now, she saw a home, a sanctuary. She had once believed that faith was something found within the four walls of a church. Now she knew it was found in the touch of a hand, in the cry of a newborn child, in the quiet, steady love of a good man. They had built a life not from the rules and laws of the world they had left behind, but from the ruins of it. Their love, which had been condemned as a sin, had become the foundation of a new world, a testament to the simple, radical belief that the only thing that could heal the deep divisions of the land was the even deeper connection between two human hearts. The seasons turned, and the years settled into the land like fine layers of river sediment, each one leaving its mark. The canyon at the meeting of the three streams, their accidental sanctuary, grew into a small but stubborn community. It was never an easy place, and the peace was often as fragile as a desert flower. But it held. The people who lived there and passed through learned that the lines drawn by the outside world, the lines of race, of creed, of allegiance, were luxuries that the harshness of the land did not afford. Survival was the only true creed, and in that, they found a common language. Their son, Samuel, grew tall and strong, a perfect fusion of his parents. He had his father's quiet, watchful eyes and his mother's deep well of compassion. Tarek taught him how to read the land, to track a deer through impossible terrain, to understand the language of the wind and the stars. Eleanor taught him how to read books, the precious few she had acquired from passing traders. She taught him about the world beyond the canyon, about the cities of the East, and about the principles of medicine her father had held so dear. Samuel learned to set a bone with the same steady hands he used to fletch an arrow. He became a man who belonged to two worlds and was therefore a master of his own, a living bridge just as his father had been. Eleanor and Tarek grew old together. The vibrant gold of her hair faded to a soft, shining silver, and the lines that etched themselves around her eyes and mouth were the map of a life filled with laughter and sorrow in equal measure. Tarek's powerful frame grew leaner, his movements slower, but his gaze never lost its hawk-like intensity. The years softened the hard edges of his warrior's past, leaving a deep and abiding wisdom in its place. Their love, born in the fire of desperation and secrecy, settled into a quiet, profound companionship. It was a language spoken not in grand declarations, but in a shared glance across a campfire, in the comfortable silence of an evening, in the way his hand would still find hers in the darkness. She continued her work as a healer, her reputation spreading far beyond the canyon. People of all kinds would make the long journey to her door, seeking her unique blend of knowledge. She became a figure of quiet legend, the white woman who knew the old ways, her skill respected by all. She never forgot her father, and in every life she saved, in every bit of pain she eased, she honored his memory. The fire that had taken him had not destroyed his legacy. It had tempered it, purified it, and passed it through her hands into this new world. When she was well past her 70th year, her body, which had endured so much, began to fail her. A weakness settled deep in her bones, a gentle but persistent fading, like the light of a long summer day finally giving way to dusk. She grew frail, her steps uncertain, until she was confined to their home, the world beyond her door becoming a distant memory. Tarek never left her side. He cared for her with the same fierce devotion she had once shown him. His large, weathered hands, now impossibly gentle as he fed her, brushed her hair, and told her stories of their life together, his voice a low, comforting rumble. One warm evening, as the sun was beginning to dip below the canyon rim, she asked him to take her to the stream. He lifted her from her bed, her body as light as a dried leaf in his arms, and carried her down the familiar path. He was still a strong man, but he walked slowly, carefully, his every step a testament to his love. The stream chuckled over the smooth, time-worn stones, the water catching the last golden rays of the sun. It was the same stream that had given them water to drink, that had nourished her garden, that had been the lifeblood of their home for nearly 50 years. He waded into the shallows, the cool water swirling around his ankles, and then, with infinite care, he lowered her into the gentle current. The water was warm from the day's heat, a silken caress against her thin, fragile skin. It was a baptism, a final, loving embrace from the land that had become her home. He held her securely, his arm a strong brace behind her back, and began to bathe her, his hands moving with a tender, practiced grace. It was an echo of a lifetime ago, a memory that existed in the very marrow of their love. The roles were reversed. He was the strong one now, the caregiver, and she the frail one, surrendering to his care. The desperate, feverish urgency of that night in the barn was gone, replaced by a profound and tranquil peace. She looked up at his face, at the noble lines and the deep-set eyes that had been her entire world for so long, and a soft, weary smile touched her lips. He leaned down, his face close to hers, his breath warm against her cheek. He whispered the words that had been the unspoken truth of his heart since the day he had first truly seen her. The Navajo warrior found sweetness. He murmured, his voice thick with the weight of a lifetime of love, and knew she was his forever. A single perfect tear traced a path through the dust and wrinkles on her cheek. She lifted a trembling hand and touched his face, her fingers tracing the familiar line of his jaw. "We built heaven from dust," she whispered back, her voice a faint, reedy sound, as soft as the breeze in the cottonwood trees. Her hand fell away, and her blue eyes, which had once been so lost in this harsh land and had then learned to see all of its beauty, slowly closed. A gentle sigh escaped her lips, and she was still. The last of her light faded with the last of the sun, leaving the canyon in a soft, purple twilight. Tarek held her in the cooling water for a long time, the silence broken only by the murmur of the stream. He did not weep. His grief was a thing too vast and deep for tears. It was a silent, empty space in a world that had, until this moment, been completely full. He carried her back to their home and laid her on their bed. Then he returned to the bank of the stream. He sat on the earth, a silent, unmoving sentinel, and kept his vigil. He watched the stars emerge one by one, cold and distant in the black sky, and he remained there as the moon made its slow journey overhead. He did not move until the first, pale fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern horizon, bringing the promise of a day she would not see. The story of their life became the story of the land itself, the people of the canyon, and their children, and their children's children, told the tale of the fierce Navajo warrior and the brave white woman who had come to them from a world of fire and ash. They named the place where the three streams met, the canyon that had been their sanctuary and their home. They called it Sweetwater Hollow, for the woman who had brought healing to so many, and for the profound sweetness a hunted warrior had found there, a sweetness that had lasted forever. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.